In the last few episodes of this series on the Akkadian Empire, we learned about the achievements of Sargon the Great, such as his conquest, the great empire that he built, the administration of that empire, as well as its lasting impact on ancient Mesopotamia. Afterwards, we took a quick look at the lives and struggles of his sons, Rimush and Manish-Tushu, both whose reigns were relatively short compared to that of their father. In this episode, we'll examine the life of Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, the last great Akkadian king. Naram-Sin, whose name can also be pronounced Naram-Suen, was already a great warrior by the time of his ascension to the throne of the Akkadian Empire in 2254 BCE. Like Sargon, he was the archetype warrior king. He expanded the borders of the Akkadian Empire to their greatest extent. Though a great conqueror, he is just as well known for his building exploits, and in later Mesopotamian literature as the subject of cautionary tales about pride and arrogance. When a new Akkadian king came to power, disgruntled citizens of the empire would take their chances and revolt. These revolts, while seemingly simultaneously occurring across the empire, were not coordinated with each other, and thus the powerful and highly organized Akkadian military machine was able to eventually put them down. Taking advantage of this military apparatus, Naram-Sin began a campaign of conquest to both consolidate his rule as well as to expand the borders of the Akkadian Empire. He conquered or forced tribute from a lot of places during his 37 years in power. I won't go over every campaign in Conquest, but here's a summary. Naram-Sin claims that his empire stretched from the cedar forest, what is today the eastern Mediterranean lands of Lebanon and the Levant, to the farthest borders of the kingdom of Marhashi, which today would be the eastern provinces of Kerman, Sistan, and Baluchistan in Iran. In the north, he claims to have gone through the lands which today make up Turkey and Armenia, from which he was able to then trace the source of the Tigris River. He also claims to have been the first to have conquered the city of Ebla, in what is today northern Syria. Perhaps the most well-commemorated of these campaigns was against a people known as the Lulubi, who lived in the Zagros Mountains. It's this campaign that's commemorated on the famous Victory Stele of Naram-Sin, today which can be seen in the Louvre. There was one event, though, that shocked the empire to the core: the Great Revolt. Like previous revolts, it began in restive southern Mesopotamia, the main hotbed of anti-Akkadian sentiment. The two main rebel leaders that we know of, Ipur Kish from the city of Kish and Amar Jirid from the city of Uruk, were reportedly chosen by their respective citizens as kings. Of course, in those days, there was no such thing as democracy or self-rule. For citizens to have chosen their own pretender kings, as Naram-Sin would call them, was an affront to both the gods and their divinely chosen servant. Thus, the rebellions had to be crushed so that the divine order could once again be established in the world, with Naram-Sin at its head. Of the two centers of rebellion, Kish was the much greater threat. For one, it was much closer to Naram-Sin's capital of Akkad. In addition, unlike rebellions in the past, which were more separate, non-coordinated events, Ipur Kish had allied with other major cities, including Borsippa, Sippar, and Kazalu. Benjamin Foster, professor of Assyriology and Babylonian literature at Yale University, explains Naram-Sin's account of the situation in his book, Age of Akkad. He states that Naram-Sin, and I quote, closed the gates of Akkad and made a passionate speech to Shamash, god of justice and treaties. In it, one may surmise that he reminded the god of the great benefits the rule of his family had brought to Kish, lifting it from dishonorable servitude and making the title King of Kish resound once more. Now the ungrateful Kishites had turned against him. After appealing to Shamash, Naram-Sin rallied the men of Akkad and marched out to battle, where he routed the Kishite army and its allies, taking many distinguished captives, whom his inscription lists by name. Ipur Kish retreated to Kish, where Naram-Sin pursued him, and they fought a second battle, in which Naram-Sin was again victorious. Another 2,500 Kishites fell in desperate street fighting in the city. Resolved to obliterate Kish, Naram-Sin dismantled its walls and diverted the river to flood it. Things in the Sumerian heartland were just as bad. There, Amar Jirid of Uruk created an alliance with many of the leading cities of the region: Adab, Isin, Lagash, Nippur, Shuruppak, and Umma. The result, though, for these rebels was nearly the same as it had been for the alliance headed by Kish. Naram-Sin marched his army south and met Amar-Jirid and his allies in battle. He took Amar-Jirid captive, flooded the city of Uruk, robbed the city of its treasures, and then dismantled its walls along with those of the other rebellious cities. From the way that they're described in Akkadian sources, putting down these revolts had been nothing short of miraculous. Thus, in his view, he, Naram-Sin, could not have simply been a mortal man. He must have been divine. At least, that's how he portrayed himself to the public. In words that were found on the base of a mostly destroyed statue, Naram-Sin states, and I quote, "Naram-Sin the mighty, king of Akkad, when the four quarters of the earth attacked him together, through the love Ishtar bore him, was victorious in 9 battles in a single year, and captured the kings whom they raised up against him. Because he defended his city in crisis, the people of his city asked of him that he be god of their city Akkad, with Ishtar in Iana, with Enlil in Nippur, with Dagan in Tutal, with Ninhursag in Kesh, with Enki in Eridu, with Sin in Ur, with Shamash in Sipar, with Nergal in Kutha, and they built his temple in Akkad." So these last few lines of the quote essentially list various popular gods and their patron city. And what it's saying at the very end is that the people in Akkad built a temple to Naram-Sin, because now he had become the patron deity of their city. This actually makes him the first king in history to have deified himself, something that his grandfather Sargon, as great as he was, never dared to do. For Sargon, it was the goddess Ishtar who granted him success. Naram-Sin, though, crossed this line between man and god, and for this, according to later literature, he'd pay a price. We'll get to that shortly. Though he considered himself to be a god, he made sure not to neglect or insult the already existing gods, especially in the Sumerian south of his empire. There, he restored and renovated already existing temples to the patron deities of other cities, especially the Ikur in Nippur, the chief temple of the god Enlil. The most lavish gifts, though, were bestowed upon the goddess Ishtar, who it's safe to say was considered to be the patron deity of the Akkadian Dynasty. Archaeologists have found several temples dedicated to her that were commissioned by Naram-Sin all over Mesopotamia, including as far north as the cities of Ashur and Nineveh, in what would later become Assyria. It turns out, though, that Naram-Sin was mortal after all. He died in 2218 BCE from what today we'd simply describe as old age or natural causes. The last king of the Akkadian line of Sargon, Naram-Sin's son and successor, Shar-Kali-Shari, lacked the charisma and ability of his two most famous ancestors. Much like them, he faced several revolts, the curse of all Akkadian kings when they came to power. However, unlike Sargon and Naram-Sin, he was ultimately overwhelmed by these revolts and quite rapidly lost large chunks of his empire. Shar-Kali-Shari seemed to be at war with everyone all at once: the Sumerians to the south, the Elamites to the east, and the newly arrived Amorite tribes in the north. He also faced a people from the Zagros Mountains, known as the Gutians, who ultimately, rightly or wrongly, were blamed for the final fall of the Akkadian Empire around 2200 BCE. Though the end of Shar-Kali-Shari's reign is generally given as 2193 BCE, by that time he probably ruled little more than the city of Akkad. Eventually, the Gutians conquered Akkad and put the final nail in the coffin of what was once the glorious Akkadian Empire. Naram-Sin's memory, though, would live on in later Sumerian and Babylonian literature, and his story becomes a cautionary tale for other rulers to keep their pride in check. In The Curse of Akkad, which was probably the most famous piece of literature regarding the last great Akkadian king, Naram-Sin incurs the wrath of the god Enlil, who ultimately causes havoc on the city of Akkad due to the king's arrogance. We'll discuss The Curse of Akkad as well as other related texts and literature in a supplemental program. So that's all for now. I'd like to really thank you for stopping by the channel and watching the video. If you learned something, please hit that like button, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing. Thanks again, and I'll catch you next time.